So that's how the affairs went in.
The
there.
July 18, 2019 meeting of the Woodbridge Township Board of Education will come to order. Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Here.
Ms. Bourdain?
Here.
Mr. Harris?
Here.
Mr. Molnar?
Here.
Mr. Sedana? Here. Mr. Tamburello? Here. Mr. Velez?
Here.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Here. Mr. Secretary, will you please make a note that Mr. Della Pietro was unable to attend due to a work conflict?
So noted.
Mr. Secretary, as required by the Sunshine Law, please read the notice of meetings.
Thank you, Mr. President. The New Jersey Open Public Meetings Law was enacted to ensure the right of the public to have advance notice of and to attend the meetings of public bodies at which any business affecting their interests is discussed or acted upon. In accordance with the provisions of this Act, the Board of Education has caused notice of this meeting to be published by having the date, time, and place thereof posted as follows. January 4, 2019, emailed to the Home News Tribune, the Star Ledger, and the Municipal Clerk's Office, posted in the Avenel Middle School and the Board of Education Administration Building.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ms. Anderson, will you please read the closed session statement?
Thank you, Mr. President. In compliance with the Sunshine Law, the board must go into closed session in order to discuss subjects exempt from the public portion of our meeting. The discussions to be held in closed session will be regarding personnel matters. Any information regarding the closed session discussion will be released to the public when the reasons for discussing these matters in closed session no longer exist.
I have a motion by Ms. Anderson. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Molnar. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried. We'll return right after closed session. Please rise for a salute to the flag and a moment of silence. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do I have a motion to reconvene?
So motion?
I have a motion by Ms. Anderson. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Molnar. All in favor?
Aye.
Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Here.
Ms. Bourdain?
Here.
Mr. Harris?
Here.
Mr. Molnar?
Here.
Mr. Sedana? Here. Mr. Tamburello? Here. Mr. Velez? Here. Mr. Treebwasser?
Here. Will someone make a motion to approve the minutes of the previous meetings?
No motion.
I have a motion by Mr. Harris. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Sedana. Are there any additions or corrections? All those in favor?
Aye.
Carried. Mr. Secretary, please state for the record any notice of bids received by the board.
Mr. President, there were no bids to report this time.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Dr. Zaga, please state for the record Superintendent's report for the month of June 2019.
Mr. President, I have the following reports to present to the board: the student registers and the security and fire drill reports, suspension reports for elementary and secondary schools, bomb threat reports, and the reports of the attendance officer.
Thank you, Dr. Zaga. Dr. Zaga, Superintendent's agenda, please.
Mr. President, I have 29 items to present to the board.
Do I have a motion for the Superintendent's agenda? So motion. I have a motion by Mr. Tamburello. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Sedana. All those in, any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar?
Yes.
Mr. Sedana? Yes. Mr. Tamburello? Yes. Mr. Velez? Yes. Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Policy and Planning agenda, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. Policy and Planning Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, presents the following 3 items. I move the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Mr. Harris. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Anderson. Any comments or questions from the board?
Mr. President,
Mr. Harris.
I just want to highlight number 2 on the Policy and Planning agenda. The district will be changing or altering 2 items on the student calendar for next school year. It's late in the school year, just making Good Friday a half a day for students and faculty, as well as the primary election of 2020, making that a half day as well. So just want to highlight for the parents. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Are there any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar?
Yes.
Mr. Sedana? Yes. Mr. Tamburello? Yes. Mr. Velez? Yes. Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Curriculum agenda, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Treebwasser. The Curriculum Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction, move the following 22 items. I move the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Mr. Harris. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Tamburello. Any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana? Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez? Yes. Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Finance and Insurance, Mr. Tamburello.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance and Insurance Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Business Administrator Board Secretary, presents the following 17 items. This evening, I move for the adoption of the foregoing 17 items.
I have a motion by Mr. Tamburello. Do I have a second?
Second?
Second by Ms. Anderson. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Mr. Wolferman, do you want to answer that?
If you look in the report, the Chase Bank, which we had a CD at, came due, so there was an interest of $60,000 that had been for that, I believe it was a 9-month CD. So that's why you see a much higher amount this particular month.
So if one were to look, typically we might be seeing, well, let me rephrase that. I was taking it at, we'd probably be in the 118 range on an ongoing monthly basis from this point forward.
No, we would have, because that's a CD and we only count the interest when it
Right.
matures, so it was a big maturity amount.
Okay.
So it's normally in that about $5,000 per investment on the ones we have at the various banks. So
right. Thank you.
probably be less. You're welcome.
Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana? Yes. Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Athletics and Extracurriculars, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Athletics and Extracurricular Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction, presents the following 11 items. I move for the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Ms. Anderson. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Tamburello. Any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana? Yes. Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Buildings and Grounds Agenda, Mr. Molnar.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Buildings and Ground Committee, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Business Administrator Board Secretary, presents the following. Tonight, I'll be moving one item.
I have a motion by Mr. Molnar. Do I have a second?
Second?
Second by Ms. Anderson. And are there any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana? Yes. Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
And Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Transportation Agenda, Mr. Velez.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Transportation Committee, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Business Administrator Board Secretary, present the following 4 items. I move for the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Mr. Velez. Do I have a second?
Second?
Second by Mr. Molnar. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana? Yes. Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Cafeteria Agenda, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Cafeteria Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Business Administrator Board Secretary, presents the following 1 item. I move for the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Ms. Anderson. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Sedana. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Personnel agenda, Mr. Molnar.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Personnel Committee, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Assistant Superintendent for Human Resources, presents the following. Tonight, I'll be moving 28 items.
I have a motion by Mr. Molnar. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Anderson. Any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Mr. Bush, do you have any recommendations this evening?
None at this time, sir.
Is there any old business that should be brought before the attention of the board?
Mr. President,
Yes, sir, Mr. Harris.
may I ask through Mr. Wolferman, please, on the Buildings and Grounds agenda, I did want to ask you a question. I missed the Buildings and Grounds Committee the other day. The track that we're replacing, how many years did we get out of it? Do you recall?
Mr. Harris, it's been about 15 years.
Okay, all right, great. All right, thank you. Was that's, to my recollection, that's about on par with the duration of tracks typically, right?
That's about the life of the truck.
Okay, great. And it's being replaced with similar style, material, rubber, or
Correct.
old sneakers, whatever, what have you?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you.
Is there any new business to be brought before the attention of the board? Okay, before I go into opening it up to the public, I just want to do a quick recap on things that are going on, just to hopefully answer people's questions so they know that we're being open and honest. The abatement at Woodbridge Middle School has been pretty much completed, and they're moving forward on getting things moving forward to getting them done and complete and ready for the beginning of the school. School 11 continues its abatement, and hopefully that will all be done by the 1st of August so they can start tearing that old building down. Items that are being addressed at School 18 are progressing nicely and moving in the proper direction. And one thing that I wanted to follow up on is we had a group of individuals at our last meeting that were here to discuss the preschool. So I just wanted to give a quick recap on that. Dr. Zega and Dr. Massimino have been to several events that were to lay out the plans for putting such a process and programs in place. Just to give everybody a rough idea, we have approximately 2,000 students that would need preschool. Maximum class size is approximately 15 students per class, which would mean that we would need approximately 134 schoolrooms, which is between 4 and 5 more buildings. Economically disadvantaged in the district is approximately 30%, and the number of special ed is approximately 40. Estimated cost just to do the special ed would be about $9 million based on $15,000 per student. Needless to say, this is not going to happen this year. I know that Drs. Dega and Dr. Massimino are certainly going to continue investigating it and to see what opportunities do present themselves in our community. But at this point, I don't see anything moving forward at this time. That's all that I have to say on the things that are going on in the district. Therefore, in keeping with past practice, I'll open up this portion of the meeting for statements from the public. If you wish to say something, please come to the microphone. Provide your name and the part of the township which you reside. For the record, please limit your comments to no more than 5 minutes in accordance with Regulation 1100D.
Good evening, Tom Maris, Forge, New Jersey. I'd like to start off by going back to the last meeting, and I'd like to thank Mr. Bush, Mr. Trebweiser, and the rest of the board for their time and courtesy. We were discussing several matters. I'm glad that you were addressing the questions. I also appreciate the fact that you have clarified the 5 minutes on the Q&A so that if someone were to come up and speak and someone from the board is responding, that doesn't take away from the questioner's 5 minutes, so that would be allowed to continue on. That said, I do have, I think, only 2 questions for this evening. And one, I haven't seen it in the curriculum. It may be there. It certainly was advertised rather heavily in some of the press, and that's the change in the curriculum that's pretty much been mandated by the state of New Jersey to address the education or training, however you want to phrase it, on LGBTQ. Has that been adopted yet? Has a policy been set forth? And is there a specific curriculum that you have formulated?
Mr. Maris, if you recall at the last meeting, I also said I would wait till you finished your 5 minutes before I answered your questions, as not to interrupt your flow.
Thank you. The second question would be, someone brought this to my attention, and I'm just looking for clarification on it. When there are, and I'm somebody that's old enough to remember we actually had to get under a desk in case there were atomic bombs being dropped. Today we're far more worried about security drills. And in that connection, I was asked if I knew anything about any of the schools having had a security and or fire drill issued at a time that the final exams were going on. I can't speak to a specific school or schools that it may have occurred. But to your knowledge, has that ever happened where they had to interrupt finals? And if so, how did you validate the testing after the students had to be stopped the testing? Am I making that clear? And that's really the only other question I have, so thank you.
Okay. The LGBTQ,
Yes.
we're in the process over the summer, as we always do, is updating all of our curricula. That is being worked on, and we will be compliant, as we are with all other curriculum that is required by the state. Regarding the drills, we would not deliberately schedule a drill during a test if there was a fire alarm or there was a situation that caused them to evacuate. Then they would, of course, follow the protocols and procedures that are in place to deal with testing standards.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. And again, sometimes when I ask this, I'm doing it to get clarification, to put misnomers to bed. In other words, somebody didn't do this purposely, nobody made a mistake and did this in the middle of a test. It didn't happen, or it should not happen, because it would not be according to your policies. And even with the curriculum question, I don't know, you'll have that formulated by the end of the summer. What is the specific date that the state wants it implemented within the school system?
That I don't know what the date is off the top of my head, but it will be ready for the beginning of the school year.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. John Tarek, Woodbridge. Just two questions. A couple of years ago, we were told that the increase of our students in the Woodbridge schools is approximately 300 to 400 people, students. Does anybody know what's the average for the last 4 or 5 years to increase our students' population in Woodbridge schools?
As I said before, Mr. Vitarak, when you're done with everything you have to say, is not to interrupt your 5 minutes. You say whatever you have to say, and I'll go answer everything when you're done.
Thank you. Second thing, on the safety of the students, last meeting I brought up the issue of how many people are at the Board of Education. There's a security building, and I was told that most of those people are at the certain schools. They go to my question would be, when you do those drills, do you do them random? Is it school officials, principals made aware of it that you're going to have it? Are the officials like yourself made aware of it? And who's actually in charge of all those decisions to make those drills? That's it.
You're finished, Mr.
Yeah.
Vitarak? Okay. As far as the number of students, we've held pretty steady between 13.2 and 13.4 over the last 5 years. We do have studies that are done that give us a cohort and anticipated increase in population in our community. I don't know how accurate they are. I just know that our current enrollment and our enrollment over the last few years has been relatively level. It hasn't really fluctuated significantly. I don't know about the 300 or so that you referenced. And as far as the school drill goes, our Director of Security is responsible for that, but as in everything else, Dr. Zega oversees all aspects of the district. So if there's a issue with the drill that is not done in compliance with his directive, then I'm sure as a Chief Administrator of the district, he will address it as he sees appropriate.
Are the principals made aware of it, when it's going to happen, the teachers?
I thought you said you had two questions. That's a third one.
Well, I'm sorry, but you didn't answer my question.
Okay. So the principals may or may not be made aware. Giving everybody a heads up when you're having a drill certainly does not give you the result and get people trained to handle a circumstance that may be a very stressful circumstance. So there could be situations where Dr. Zega or Brian Small, our Director of Security, feels that it's a necessity not to give an advance notice and to have a drill and see how it goes, and to find out what areas we need to work on, or if we're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Mr. President?
Yes, sir, Dr. Massimino.
Just to touch base, there is a police officer present at every security drill that oversees it with the administration. So there's, at no point are they doing this solo. They're doing it in cooperation with the Woodbridge Police Department and their supervision.
Good evening, Raul Castillo, Middlesex County Council for Young Children. Before any comments, I'd just like to thank the board and the school's administration for all of their help and assistance on the possibility of applying for the NJPEA grant. The New Jersey Preschool Expansion Aid Grant is something that continues to grow. For those who may not know, this year, over 150 school districts in New Jersey were deemed eligible. Mandatory meetings for those districts were held last week and this week as well. I appreciate the comments earlier on the school administration attending these meetings, crunching up the numbers, and understanding that this may not be something that can be done possibly this year. I just wanted to share with you all that Governor Murphy and the legislators have really made preschool expansion one of their top priorities, and universal preschool is something that they say will be coming within the next few years for the entire state. Although we've done a lot of work so far, I would just recommend that the district not close the door entirely on this. I would say to be proactive if possible, because this may be something that could be coming within the next few years, if it comes from the state down. And before I go, I'd also like to just touch base on, the benefits of preschool. Oftentimes we have conversations on preparing our high school students for college and for the real world, right? But if we really want to see long-term success, I think it's time to shift that focus and talk about how we can prepare our 3- and 4-year-olds for kindergarten. It's an investment that we will be making into our future, and we will see that come back tenfold. I also ask everyone to look at this situation from a family standpoint. For working families, currently in Woodbridge Township, they're paying a private provider, or they may, to attend a preschool, or they may be paying for a day type of program, some sort of day program. Preschool expansion and offering free preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds in this community would allow working families to use those dollars on something else. It would also make Woodbridge Township a more desirable town for people to move in or people to open businesses. And like I mentioned before, a few extra $100s, thousands of dollars in a household could turn families from renters to homeowners. It could turn some of their hobbies into businesses. It could really have a major effect on families in this community. And just to go over some more numbers, currently, the state of New Jersey, 113 districts have taken advantage of the preschool expansion aid grant. Woodbridge Township is eligible. I think it would be something to look into even further. I would also like to mention that although this year has seemed like a time crunch, a lot has been done. We've partnered with ACNJ, the Advocates for Children of New Jersey. We've talked to nonprofit organizations like Pre-K Our Way. We've even made a few phone calls to the Department of Education just to see what we can do on our end as a community to support the Board of Education, the school, the administration, and staff, and most importantly, our children. I can say that the Woodbridge Township County Council for Young Children will continue to attend meetings. We will continue to do our work, meet with different representatives from different agencies, continue to educate ourselves on this matter, and we hope to continue a partnership with the district, with the Board of Education, at least a conversation and discussion, so that we do not completely close the door on the children that are 3 and 4 years old in this community. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Erin Markin. I live in Colonia. I have older children, so my family would not benefit directly for preschool expansion here in Woodbridge Township. But I still want this for our community. I want to thank everybody for attending the meetings and for making a good effort to get this here in such short notice. My understanding is that it's always short notice when this the budget and this funding is put out from the state. I really hope that maybe you'll consider rolling out on a smaller scale here in Woodbridge, not for all 2020 students that are eligible, 3 and 4-year-olds, but possibly 2 classrooms in a local provider. So mixed delivery, not in buildings that you already own. We don't have much longer, and I know your decision is, or hopefully is only tentatively, that you're not going to do it, but I really hope that you guys continue to speak and roll this out on a very small scale next year. I think the deadline to apply is August 1st. And if you cannot do that, if you don't think that's even a possibility, which I hope that you decide it is, but if you cannot do that on a small scale in October of next year, or this coming school year, I hope that you really work on it from now until this money becomes, or potentially becomes available again next summer, so that you are really ready to roll something out, either on a small scale or for all 2,000 students. Again, I appreciate that you've done so much, and I hope that your work doesn't stop here, and I hope that you continue to ask us as a county council for young children and parents of preschoolers that cannot afford childcare preschool otherwise, that you ask for us to help you get this done also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, first of all, I just want to clarify. By no means, if I gave you the impression that we were closing the door on this, that's not the case. What I thought I had conveyed was that we are probably not going to be able to get anything done for this year, only because of the sheer magnitude of it and the lack of space. Because of our special ed needs, we really can't do it on a small scale. We need a certain number of classrooms just to house that. So our small scale for us may be 30 classrooms. So what we're going to do, based on one of the board members who made an excellent suggestion, that we are going to post on the website a letter explaining where we're at, and we'll try and keep you updated on where we're making progress and what our obstacles are and what our opportunities are.
Wonderful, thank you. And with the special needs focus, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. That's something that's big for us also. Could rolling it out on a small scale be just more special needs classrooms? Maybe special needs inclusion classrooms?
Based on the numbers, I think we need 30 classrooms to be able to handle our preschool special ed group.
Okay, but just not expanding on what you already have?
No, they have to be full day. They can't be half day.
Oh, yes, yeah. I know some of your special needs preschool kids are full day.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
And perhaps this goes without saying, but I'm going to be the wet blanket here because it's my job as the lawyer just to say, I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge on this, but in addition to 30 classrooms, it would also require facilities of a particular manner, right, with respect to bathrooms and other ADA compliance. I mean, we couldn't just, for example, even if we had the money, and it's not easy to come by these days with school finance, but if we had the money to be able to just get a building with 30 rooms, it doesn't work that way. So this is a very complicated issue that, as the president explained, the board's going to take a deeper look at, but something that's not an overnight type of commitment.
Yes. Certainly not a dead issue. Certainly something that Dr. Zaga and Dr. Massimino have invested a significant amount of time in, and they would not have invested that much time if it was something they were not passionate about and didn't recognize the value of it. So
awesome. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate the passion and continuing the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chief Wester?
Yes, sir, Mr. Harris.
I wanted to, if possible, if Dr. Zaga can explain the number of special ed preschool students we have today. It's approximately 200, correct, between 3 and 4-year-olds. So just wanted to make sure that was known, that we are already providing preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds. I guess of certain learning.
NDSL, Mr. Harris.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And the fact that Dr. Zaga and Dr. Massimino did their homework to the extent of speaking with upwards of 20 private daycare providers here in the town as well. So it wasn't simply just a look at the numbers, but it was actually an on the ground meeting and discussing with the private school operators that are throughout the district, right, Dr. Zega? So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
I'll let you.
Dr. Zega, did you want to say anything?
Dan said it all.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Megan Brown. I'm Colonia. I just have a quick question about the special needs. Well, if preschool does roll out, will it be a mixed classroom with neurotypical and special needs kids? Will that be the goal? Do you
I don't know that we can comment at this time. I don't think we're that far into it.
Okay.
Ideally, we would like to have them be inclusive,
I think that would be.
but I don't know enough about the special needs population and what their actual need is and whether that works for them or not.
Okay.
If it does, that would be ideal.
Yeah, that would be ideal. I hope that we would take that into consideration. I
Absolutely.
have two preschool age, well, 3 kids, 2 of whom will be preschool age in the next 5 years. So I just really hope that I have a lot of friends in the area too that we moved here. A lot of people moved here for a school district that is good, that we could afford, and I think that it would have been a no-brainer to move here if we had there was a 3K and 4K. So I think more people would move here specifically for the school district, and it would do. Even if you don't have preschool age kids, your property values will hopefully also improve. So that's just my 2 cents. So thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Chair will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So motion.
I have a motion by Mr. Molnar. Do I have a second? Second by Ms. Bourdain. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.